To say that The Lord of the Rings is a work that needs no introduction is both an understatement and an overstatement. If you have any interest in the fantasy genre of movies, literature, gaming, or even music, then you already know exactly what it is, and there's a good chance you already understand why it's such a foundational work in this genre. At the same time, there are still many who don't. And while an in-depth attempt to explain how J.R.R. Tolkien's magnum opus became so influential could easily run the length of a documentary series, I'll attempt to provide the Spark Notes version as best I can. The Lord of the Rings is the quintessential fantasy adventure novel. While it borrows heavily from folklore and mythology, especially from that of Northern Europe, primarily Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavia, J.R.R. Tolkien was perhaps the first author to truly extract these ideas from their origins and reinvent them to mean something new. Dwarves are originally from Norse mythology, but dwarves as we know them today are from the works of Tolkien. Orc is an archaic word for a demon or monster, similar in vein to an ogre, a boogeyman type creature that would vary wildly from place to place. But orcs as a fantasy race, as we know them, come from the world of Middle-earth. Tolkien did more than just reinvent the wheel when it came to world building and narrative, going as far as to create functional languages for the creatures that made up his rich setting. He also, as I said, pulled heavily from folklore, myth, and legend, paying particular attention to story structure, characterization, and thematic writing. The end result is a story that collects tropes in circulation since antiquity, and uses these tried and true methods of storytelling to great effect, while also turning them on their heads to bring new life into what is essentially one of the oldest genres of storytelling in the world, the fantasy adventure. One such example has to do with the plot of the story itself. As we've discussed with prior movies, one of the oldest and widely used patterns in fantasy is the quest to recover something, whether it be a golden fleece, a holy grail, or the Book of the Dead. This is in effect the plot of The Hobbit. The dwarves adventure to recover the Arkenstone, and Bilbo recovers a long-lost magic ring. But The Lord of the Rings itself turns this trope directly upside down. The band of heroes do not quest to retrieve something, but instead set out to destroy something which was already retrieved. It may not be the first work of literature to pull a trick like this, but combined with how massively influential The Lord of the Rings has become, it isn't insignificant. But I told you everything you already knew. You may have just not connected the dots yet. In this day and age, even if you've never read The Lord of the Rings or seen its famous movie adaptations, it's near impossible to say you haven't been exposed to its influence in some way, as it can be found both directly and indirectly in many books, movies, tabletop games, video games, and yes, even music. Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings into a trilogy of movies is the best known piece of media to result from the novels. But it might surprise you to learn that it was not the first movie adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. In 1977, famed animator Ralph Bakshi, who is known for his adult-oriented works such as Fritz the Cat and Harlem Nights, set his eyes on an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings that was already in pre-production at MGM. He got involved with the project and convinced the studio to turn what would have been one live-action film into a two-part animated epic. The film was greatly constrained by both time and budget, and ultimately the second film was never made. The end result is The Lord of the Rings, which debuted in 1978. The plot of this adaptation follows the novel quite closely, and is at times more faithful to the source material than even Peter Jackson's version, which actually borrows quite a number of shots from this film. In the village of Hobbiton, nestled safely in the Shire, Bilbo Baggins, the protagonist of The Hobbit, celebrates his 111th birthday by mysteriously leaving for the land of the elves, but not before gifting his nephew Frodo Baggins the magic ring he found during his adventure with a band of dwarves many years ago. However, when it's revealed by the traveling wizard Gandalf that the ring is actually a dangerously powerful artifact of the Dark Lord Sauron and was thought previously lost, it's decided that Frodo, accompanied by some of his friends, must take the ring to the court of King Elrond, Lord of the Elves of Rivendell. There, a council is convened and it's determined that the ring must be destroyed before Sauron can reclaim it. Frodo volunteers to undertake this journey, but he does not do it alone. Accompanied by his 8 companions, the Fellowship of the Ring ventures to the dark lands of Mordor to destroy the One Ring before it is too late. Since the film was originally imagined as the first of 2 parts, it does not tell the complete story and stops abruptly at the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep. There is an unofficial sequel of sorts, made in 1980 by a different studio titled The Return of the King, which functioned as a sequel to that same studio's adaptation of The Hobbit. Many people believe the 1980 Return of the King is the outright sequel to Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, but that is not actually true. As for the Bakshi film itself, there's a lot to dissect. It's a very good adaptation in the sense that it's very faithful to its source material. A significant portion of the dialogue is actually directly transposed from the novels to the screen. However, there are large plot threads which are completely cut, primarily for time, which is understandable. Where Bakshi took most of his liberties is with the art design, but even then, they do remain fairly accurate to how Tolkien described things. The most notable feature of this film is that it uses an animation style known as rotoscoping. Rotoscope animation basically boils down to live-action footage that has been traced over and converted into animated images. It's a very famous technique because of its use in Disney's Snow White in 1937. One of the pros of rotoscope is that it results in very fluid movement, which this movie actually uses to excellent effect in action scenes. It also lessens the amount of time needed to be spent animating frames by shooting live-action footage first. The conversion from live-action to animation takes a lot less time than if each frame was to be drawn individually. The end result significantly lowers the cost of production at the end of the day. It might surprise you that despite how gloating I've been concerning rotoscope animation, I actually don't care for it myself. There's something about it that's sort of vertigo-inducing to me. Have you ever heard a person, maybe an older relative, describe a 3D video game as making them dizzy? Well, that's how I would describe rotoscope's effect on me. I want to clarify though that while I have personal issues with the technique, many people don't. And to the film's credit, as I said, the action scenes in particular are where the rotoscope animation really shines. It looks fluid and smooth, and things that would normally be somewhat stilted in traditional animation, like sword swings, appear to cut through the air like butter because of it. However, one thing I think most people would agree with me on is that the character designs for this film are particularly ugly and not at all pleasing to look at. Samwise in particular is a rather horrid-looking abomination that is bizarrely out of place next to his far more humanoid-looking kin. The orcs are depicted as jet black, shadowy beings, which contrast very sharply with the more vibrant heroes. An interesting artistic choice, but not one that I personally find pleasing on the eyes. Boromir as a barbarian-esque Viking is a very strange adaptation compared to Tolkien's account of a well-groomed, civilized individual of an aristocratic background. Bakshi's Lord of the Rings is a lot like those replicas of Da Vinci's Last Supper you see all the time. They aren't exact, but they're close. The artists take liberties of their own, but they stick very closely to what they're trying to recreate. The end result is a piece that stands on its own just fine, but is sort of a pale shadow when compared to the original. Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings did perform well at the box office, making $30 million on a $4 million budget. However, reviews were mixed, with many being disappointed that the story was incomplete. Why this did not result in its originally intended sequel is anyone's guess. According to Bakshi himself, there was some drama behind the marketing of the movie, which he felt made it underperform, but he also describes its impact on him as wearing him out as well. All this said and done, this is a film I'm happy to have exist, even though I don't personally care for it that much. It was an important step in the foundation of our modern genre of fantasy, being a major adaptation of such a cornerstone piece of literary canon. It was also integral to the live-action trilogy eventually being produced, as Peter Jackson stated it was a big influence on the visual direction of those movies. If you have never watched this adaptation before, and are curious about it, there is no harm in watching it. It runs a very comfortable length of just over 2 hours and has very good pacing. If you have never seen an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, I personally recommend you don't watch this film, primarily because it is not the complete story. If you have watched Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and enjoyed them, then by all means go ahead and watch this one too. You will definitely find some enjoyment in it, whether appreciating the dedication to the source material, smoothness of the rotoscoping, or just giggling like a child at how vomit-inducing Samwise's appearance is. Nevertheless, one thing remains for certain regardless of which Lord of the Rings adaptation you decide to delve into, or if you delve into the source material directly. The influence of Tolkien's work reverberates throughout so much of the fantasy genre at this point that he can very much be considered the godfather of contemporary fantasy. And anytime we take a step into modern fantasy works, Whether it be Dungeons & Dragons, The Elder Scrolls, or even Star Wars, you'll always find at least a sliver of Middle-earth if you know where to look.